That's an amazing copy. Do you know anything about who it belonged to, or any of the
Yes,
prominents?
it belonged to Brigham Young's wife.
Okay. All right, let me hold it one more time, man. I got to see this thing. So what are you doing to me?
We want to know why. We don't want to start replacing labels and making them all look alike.
Right.
All the existing copies of the Book of Mormon, 350 today, nobody can find two that are identical because they all have different typographical errors.
So
We're
that brings up the
custodians.
question,
Yeah, we're
why would
stewards.
somebody do this then?
Money.
And then I saw the thing that made my jaw drop.
Wow.
But there was a third death mask. And this one most people don't know exists. Up in plaster.
But there is some
Who's making that decision?
Those are inexperienced people.
They let the mask in the hands of an unexperienced person and said, go ahead and clap a couple extra inches on that chin.
Right.
Welcome to this episode of the WKJS podcast. I recently made what I think is a huge discovery on the death masks. So I've invited expert guest John Hajicek to join me today to talk about that and some other items that are related, which I think are just going to be groundbreaking items regarding the history of Mormonism. So, John, thanks for coming. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
John is a Mormon material culture historian. Did I get that right? That title?
It's a kind of an all-encompassing title. Material culture sometimes can be thought of as anthropological or related to tools or stone or textiles, but I think of material culture in our field as including the printing history of our sacred books, our paintings, our sacred temple objects, our architecture, maps, newspapers, anything paper.
Normally when people are thinking of a historian in the church, that's not what they're thinking of, correct?
Well, it would include this field, but most church historians are classroom historians or academic historians, or they just write books and they do their research online. I'm more of what you would call a practical historian or practicing historian. So I actually touch and handle and care for physical objects.
So I was trying to remember, how long have we known each other now? Was it 2018, 2017, something like that? So the way that I met John is I had found a first edition copy of the Book of Mormon that I was really interested in, and I sent it over to John and asked him what his opinion was about it, because if you find him online, you can see more copies of the first edition Book of Mormon has passed through your hands than anybody. Anyway, he took a look at it and he said, that is a restoration. And I was like, what? What are you talking about, restoration? And you just blew my mind on that. Can you tell me what that means to you?
Well, restoration is an okay word. It's just that in my style, we work with very delicate restoration, and we work with the least intrusive possibility in preserving a book. So it's about ultimately preservation and conservation. And sometimes you have to do restoration if the hinges are cracked on a book, there may be a reason to do minimalistic restoration. So I'm a minimalist.
Yeah.
But there are people that are, of course, taking first edition books, Mormon, and anything, temples, stone artifacts. There are people that are taking objects and completely reworking them very intrusively and in ways that aren't reversible, and dramatically changing the appearance and the history of the object.
Right. So you convinced me of that, and although I thought that copy that I had found was really cool, I decided I didn't want that. So I asked John to find me a first edition copy. And I don't know if you remember the story or not, but I think you found it maybe it was an estate sale or something like that, and it had been sitting in a cigar box in somebody's attic for all this time.
That's the copy that came from. That copy came from Pennsylvania, from the Great Bend area where Joseph translated the Book of Mormon. Right.
So here it is. Do you remember it?
I do, yes.
So if I was to hand that book to a normal historian, what would their reaction be?
Well, Mormon historians don't handle a lot of objects. Mormon historians typically work with flat screens. They're
Right.
working with their smartphones and their iPads and their computers, sometimes several computers at their desk looking at objects. So even the very best Mormon historians don't get to handle rare documents and rare books
Right.
often.
So I absolutely love this copy now, and I would never try to restore it because it's in pretty good shape. And the reason why I wouldn't, one of the things that you pointed out to me when you found it that you were excited about was that it had some of this writing in there, and we never figured out who those names are, but one of these days, some people might erase that out or put a
Correct.
different page or something like that to
Sure,
make
right.
it. And I'm like, no, that
Right.
is part of the history.
Right.
But again, these are the things that you taught me when I was first learning about material culture.
And because of that, here's another 1830 Book of Mormon.
Okay.
If we intruded on every copy and painted the books and added gold and changed the appearance of the book, I might not have recognized that this particular copy was bound just slightly different from the other copies, and was able to determine that this copy was bound in Kirtland. And so when you print books, even today, and you say,
but it's a first edition.
It's a first
but
edition,
it wasn't printed in Palmyra.
which is extraordinary because in Palmyra, they contracted with Grandin, Martin Harris, mortgaged his farm for $3,000, and they contracted to print and bind 5,000 copies, which is extraordinary because you don't normally bind all the copies of any book right away, but they were confident. So they printed and bound 5,000 copies. But as even today, you do what we call an overrun. They were extras. So they probably printed 5,000 books and bound 5,000 books, but they actually probably printed enough signatures because you run short. You don't want to run short of just one gathering, so you just do a little bit of an overrun. So maybe they actually printed 5,100, but the contract only required them to bind 5,000. So somehow a handful of remaining copies were probably carried to Kirtland in uncut sheets, maybe 100, I would guess.
So,
and bound in Kirtland.
How many of those would you say there are today, the first edition that are bound in Kirtland that are in existence?
5 or 10.
So it's very rare.
One of the other ways we know this was bound in Kirtland, we can study the binding because the binding hasn't been tampered with. It has integrity. So I can compare this to other books bound in Kirtland, like the hymnals and the Doctrine and Covenants and the Message and Advocate. But also there's a references, an index in this copy that we can determine that that index was printed in Kirtland. It's the same typography, the same case of type that's used to make the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835. So this copy of the Book of Mormon was bound in Kirtland, and we only know that because we're not altering it and messing with the book.
So is that the condition when you found that book, what it was like?
Yes, we've done nothing to this book.
Okay, so that's an amazing copy. Do you know anything about who it belonged to, or any of the prominents?
Yes, it belonged to Brigham Young's wife.
Okay. So how do you find something like that?
I bought this from a collector who's been collecting for many, many decades.
Like, and he found you and reached out and said, hey.
He's been a friend of mine for 40 years.
Did you have to talk him into giving it up, or was he like, it's time? Okay.
And then here's a book that has not been altered in any way. It's not been polished. It's original.
Yeah.
This book, so I wanted to bring you the copy Brigham Young gave his wife, and this is the copy that one of your favorite people gave his wife. That's a copy given by Willard Richards to his wife.
To his wife? You're England. Kidding.
Probably the first Book of Mormon to leave North America, or it certainly left North America with the first mission out of North America. Anyway, this copy has this extraordinary inscription from a present for Janetta Richards.
All right, let me hold it one more time, man. I got to see this thing. This is Willard Richards.
This is given to Janetta Richards on the date of their wedding in 1838, and then she came with him to America, and he was from the Berkshires. He dropped her off in the Berkshires because she was sick, and he went to Nauvoo, and he left her there. He went back later to get her, but they didn't get the Book of Mormon. They left the Book of Mormon in the Berkshires, and it surfaced last year still in the Berkshires.
Wow.
This copy is the copy that John Taylor gave to his
So
wife.
what are you doing to me?
So I brought you Willard Richard's copy and John Taylor's copy, your two favorite people, and Brigham Young. The copies they gave to their wives. John Taylor
so John Taylor got this, gave it to his wife.
He owned the print shop at the time, so he owned the bindery. So you notice this copy is extraordinarily bound.
It's beautiful,
complete full red Moroccan go. He presented to Annie Ballantyne's sister, who was Jane Ballantine. He had two wives that were sisters.
I've seen what you're doing here. All right, that is astounding. How many copies, first edition copies from Palmyra are in existence today, if you had to guess?
I think 350,
Okay.
and I found about 150 of those. And I don't mean I brokered them or I held them. I mean I owned them. I found them, about 150 out of the 350. And it might be creeping up a little bit.
And out of those three,
they were saying 250 before I started finding.
So you started at, you were thinking 250, and now you're thinking 350. What is the general condition of?
Because a few of mine were found.
Okay.
In the hands of other collectors.
What was the general condition of those typically?
Most of them are in poor condition, and it affects our perception about what a good copy is.
Yeah.
If you've only seen restored copies, typically a Book of Mormon today is found missing pages.
Yeah.
And I would say, in 1991, when I started actively pursuing as many first edition Books of Mormon as I could, half of them were incomplete.
Out of the 350, how many of those would you say have been restored?
Oh, hundreds.
Hundreds of them? Okay.
Yeah, most of them probably have been restored. Well, so here's a copy, not my book, a book restored by one of my colleagues that showed up with no label, no gilding left on the backstrip of the book. So it's before and after here. This is on the left how it looked when he acquired it, and this is on the right how it looked when he sold it. So it starts out as a very attractive book with some folk restoration. It looks like it's got a cord that's been stab stitched through the entire book, even through the boards. And this colleague of mine has completely restored it and put a new label on it to replicate an old label, and he's even added gold.
So
and
again,
painted the book.
It looks beautiful. I'm not going to say it doesn't, but why are you against that? Restoring it rather than keeping it in that condition on the left.
Well, because if you wanted that, you can go out and buy one at Costco for $20.
So I brought one of those. If you want to get it as close to this original, here's what that would look like. You can get that from Costco now, right?
Right. So this is an artifact. It's not just the text of the book. The text is well preserved, but this is an artifact that tells us something about the printing of the book.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand that the bindings do have variation, and we're trying to understand why. The original labels have some variation, and we're trying to understand why. There are different physical attributes to the book. There's, we're studying the paper to find out more about where the paper was made, and I believe it was made almost in the shadows of the Hill Cumorah. We're studying the leather, which I'm the first to propose came right from the Palmyra area. There were more sheep in Ontario County and Wayne County than there were people. So there was a lot of leather there. The tanning was the #1 occupation in Palmyra during the printing and binding of the Book of Mormon.
Also, where the book is part of the journey of the book, of that.
Amen.
These people were carrying them, and where they went through, and all the struggle that everybody who traveled experienced. And so to have something that looks completely like it didn't go through that struggle is really unfortunate. It's not.
I completely agree. If you restore it, you could be damaging something that's super important historically. Whether you know that today or maybe 50 years from now, you don't know. That's why again, you convinced me right off the bat, do not restore them. It's okay to try to preserve them if they're way out of whack, but.
And yours didn't need restoration.
Correct.
If the hinges are cracked, we do some delicate restoration because we want to freeze the We want to freeze the deterioration of the book.
Right.
So if the book is going to be worse in 50 years because we didn't do something, we certainly want to stop. We want to stop acidic intrusion. If there's things inside of the book that are
Yeah.
acidic, we want to remove them. We don't want the hinges to crack further.
So tell us about this edition.
Well, it's the same thing. There's a before and an after, and you can just see extensive restoration, particularly the gold gilding on the
this
rules.
binding for
He's
sure.
filled in at the top, missing leather.
Oh wow.
And then he's painted the books.
Oh,
I don't
is
understand
that's
the
not a
painting
new
of the
cover.
books.
That's like the same cover painted.
That's the same cover painted. You can
Mm.
see the dark and light areas.
Mhm.
It's been shoe polished.
You're right. Oh wow. Yeah. Shocking. All right, tell us about this.
And there you
version.
see the exact same thing. You can look, once you're accustomed to it, you can see that that's the same book, a before and after. One of the interesting things is this is a copy that did not have gold. They didn't all have gold. Some of them had what we call blind stamp. It's like a black rule.
You're talking about these lines.
The black. I think some
okay.
copies are black and not gold.
Okay.
So I appreciate and love the variation in the binding, in the labels. The labels were made out of scrap leather. Most of them are black. Some of them are brown. A few are green or red.
Right.
They have different fonts. Some are larger fonts and some are smaller. And we want to know why. We don't want to start replacing labels and making them all look alike.
Right.
Because we would like to understand a little bit more about what it might be like for Joseph and his family to be in the print shop, especially Hyrum and Joseph Smith Sr. in the print shop, the Cowdery family. Cowdery is part of the Whitmers. I mean, the Whitmer family and Oliver Cowdery are in the print shop and the bindery. We want to understand how that dynamic is all taking place.
Right.
And ultimately, a lot of it is about the text. So what kind of corrections were they making to the text while the book was being printed? It's extremely important. So there are no two copies that have ever been found of the Book of Mormon that are identical, because they were actually making corrections as they printed these gatherings, these signatures, these large galleys, one sheet at a time of 16 pages. They 8 on each side. They were proofreading and passing the sheets around and making corrections and improvements to the text while it was being printed. Right. And then there are 37 different signatures that are gathered together and sewn together, but they're piles of 2,500 of each of them to make 5,000 books. A complicated story, but sufficient to say that of all the existing copies of the Book of Mormon, 350 today, nobody can find two that are identical, because they all have different typographical errors, and one might be more advanced on one side of the page and the other might be more advanced on the reverse side of the page, because they're flipping the paper while they're printing.
To clarify what you said, so there was 5,000 plus original copies. Today there's about 350.
Right, they made 5,000 on 2,500 sheets.
Out of the 350 currently exist, not one of those is identical, because of the printing process was changing as they were printing. Yeah, it's amazing.
The books aren't like ours to completely redo. They're part of history and they belong to everybody.
Right.
And so to completely change it it's like not anyone's, I don't think, place to decide that I'm going to completely change this, because it's not actually theirs.
So that brings up the question, why would somebody do this then?
Money.
Just to increase.
Because they will take that book, which they would have to describe. So booksellers use categories we call fine, very good, good, poor, fair, or poor. And the seller here is taking a good or poor copy, but actually a typical copy, a very average copy, because a Book of Mormon is used heavily, and they're trying to make the book a very good copy and present it to a customer. And they don't use these phrases we use in the business, in the profession, in the library profession, or any of these related professions. They won't call the books fine and very good. They'll say, on a scale of 1 to 10, this is a 9. And so
wait, are you saying they don't tell them it's restored?
I don't know.
They did not tell me that it
Right.
was restored.
Right.
I didn't know to ask that though.
They'll
So if
just
I'd
sell
asked,
this
maybe
book.
they would have
They'll
said,
just
but
sell
yeah,
this book as a 9 on a scale of 1 to 10.
right.
But it's typical. It's a 5. It's not bad to have a book in that condition. That's how you should be finding a
Right.
Book of Mormon, and you should put it into a clamshell box
Yeah.
like yours or one of these boxes, and you preserve the book, and you do restoration to it only as needed to prevent it from continuing its deterioration. But
Yeah.
you don't want to.
Yeah.
You're actually damaging these books when you do that extensive of a restoration.
I just want to put a plug in for you and others that have the same discipline as you. If somebody's watching this happens to have, from however they received that, a first copy edition or any of the early edition important manuscripts and scriptures, don't just run off and restore that thing. Find John, however you can find him, and
Okay.
ask him, what do you think of this? And if it's something that needs to be
Sure, I make
repaired, you would say so.
recommendations.
But
Right.
you-
Mhm.
yeah, so that's very important. Again, this is the difference between John and other historians and really other material culture experts, is he doesn't want to create a new object. He wants to preserve the history of the object that we have. Because even if it doesn't seem significant today, 50 years from now, there might be some new investigation where there's a detail in that object that now suddenly comes into play.
Exactly.
So it's incredibly important to try to restore, or not restore history, but to keep the history the way that it is.
Preserve and conserve.
Preserve and conserve, right.
Not rebuild.
This same thing applies to something that John's probably the expert in the world on. He's already one of the top experts on first edition copies of the Book of Mormon. This next one, not a lot of people are familiar with the Sunstones that were on the Nauvoo temple originally. So how do you even begin to talk about Sunstones with somebody who's not very familiar with it?
Well, they're the iconic symbol of Mormonism. The temple was built and was dedicated in 1846, but it was the groundbreaking was in 1841, and it burned in 1848. So there's just a very small window there where we could enjoy this important iconic Mormon sculpture. So there were 30 sunstones around the top of the temple, and there were 30 moonstones as base stones. The sunstones were the capitals at the top of each pilaster, and then above those on the frieze there were star stones, 30 star stones. So 30 suns, 30 moons, 30 stars. Well, when the temple burned in 1848 and was knocked down in 1850 and dynamited ultimately in 1865, these stones came tumbling down from the height that they were, 80 feet, I think it was, and came crashing down. So most didn't survive. There are 2 very nice examples of sunstones in existence. One is owned by the federal government, and it's on display at the Smithsonian, and the other is owned by the state government of Illinois.
Now tell us about these 2 photos.
So these are both the exact same stone. On the left, the before picture is the sunstone while it was on display in the Nauvoo State Park. So that's the state stone. And on the right, it is the stone while on loan to the Salt Lake Church and on display at their historic site in Nauvoo. And you can see some extensive restoration on the nose, especially.
So that's what I was going to ask you is, okay, I didn't, when I first pulled this up, know it's the same stone because it looks so different.
Right. They fixed the nose. They haven't fixed the trumpets yet in these photos, but they have also fixed, when you look at the original, you can see the coloration when you're standing right in front of it, and you can see that there's been restoration done at all different times, including on the sun rays and other parts.
And it's located where?
It was in the Nauvoo State Park, and now it's at the church history site.
Great. And they have. You can see the condition when it was in, and instead of leaving it in that condition, maybe cleaning it up a little bit, they actually restored it, which
most art historians
changed
wouldn't
it.
even clean it, really. They would delicately clean it, but they wouldn't take all of the patina off.
Because the patina is important, unless it's like decroding it somehow, correct?
Right, but the idea isn't to make it look new. If you want a new one, you can make a new one.
Right.
It's a historic artifact.
It's on loan from
the state of Illinois has loaned it to the church.
But if
The
it's
And
on
the
Salt Lake
church is the one that altered it?
Yes.
Well, why am I not surprised about that? As soon as they
It's
get
on
their
the
hands
list.
on an artifact, that's what they do is restore it, right?
Right.
I didn't realize that. That's a good question. How did they let them do that?
I don't know.
Hmm.
But here's the other stone.
Let me pull this up. There you go. So are these the same stone?
These are the same stone. And this stone was also once in Illinois, owned by the Historical Society in Quincy in Adams County.
Mm-hmm.
And on the right, it's on display at the Smithsonian. They cleaned it. Interestingly, the eyes were painted and they look cross-eyed. It's
In
hard
this
to tell.
version, you mean? Yeah.
Yes, and we don't know now because that has been removed and we can't analyze it, whether that actually looked, when you're looking up at it, correct, or if that was vandalism. We
Huh.
have no way of knowing whether that was vandalism it's in photographs taken in 1880.
I see.
So that those colored eyes had
With the
existed.
eyes like that?
The Sunstones may have actually all been painted, but we don't know because the Smithsonian cleaned it
So
and took off the paint off of the eyes.
you're thinking that the paint could have been original?
It could be. We don't know.
Oh, wow. And why would the Smithsonian do that? Wouldn't they have better practices than to destroy an important artifact
Well, at least
like
they
this?
didn't do any restoration to the stone. They cleaned
Right.
it. They extensively cleaned it.
So I've moved the one at the Smithsonian today. Anyone could go see that. This is what it looks like on display. I've moved that to the left. So what's this one on the right?
So this is the Nauvoo temple replica that they built between 1999 and 2002. It's dedicated in 2002, and they replicated the 30 sunstones going around the perimeter of the tops of the pilasters. And you can see that they have completely revised what a sunstone looks like.
Yeah.
Instead of having the gloomy, brooding, trumpet blowing sunstone, they put a kissy face on it.
He's kind of a happy fellow. Huh?
And they've made other changes too.
So who do you know who would make a decision like this, that we're going to change it a little bit more for modern day?
It could be
rather
the
than that?
architects, it could be the historical department, it could be the first presidency. We don't know.
Yeah, those are completely
So
different.
look at the nose too. We don't know what the nose looks like because the nose on the Smithsonian and on the state of Illinois are both broken. So the church had to conjecture a nose, which is a very rounded nose.
So I can understand that. They didn't want to have a broken nose on there. But how would they have decided this
We
is
don't
what it's
know.
going to look like?
Right.
Nobody knows.
So we don't actually know. And then notice the trumpets went from long and slender to fat.
Right. Yeah, I can
Heavier.
see that too.
The lips.
The lips are the biggest one for me. It looks happy. Like he's smiling. This one, not so much.
I think the one on the right looks terrifying.
You think?
Yeah.
Yeah, and these big, the jowls, right. Interesting. All right.
I mean, the shape of the faces looks different too.
There, that's the one
Okay.
the two
All right.
churches just exchanged along with the Kirtland Temple. They changed.
Wait, so there was
exchanged.
a third? It wasn't
It's
just the two?
incomplete. So when they tell the story that there are two complete sunstones, they deliberately left out their stepsister church, which they knew owned one, because it was incomplete. So they were able to say there's only two complete ones in existence, and we
Oh.
have one of them on loan, even though down the street there was an incomplete one.
Got
It's
it.
missing the trumpet stone
Because
that
it
sits
doesn't
on
have
the
the
top.
trumpets.
So 2/3 of the stone is the face stone, and
Hmm.
1/3 of it is the trumpet stone that sits as the two together make an ensemble.
So yeah, that one's just in bad shape. Is that what the other ones would have looked like before repairs, or?
No, that one is in worse shape.
Okay.
But look at the pictures of the Sphinx, and you can see that we as archaeologists, we save defaced stones. We
Right.
don't in any sense destroy sculptures that are missing their noses, or you wouldn't restore that nose, nor would you destroy the statue because
Right.
it's defective or incomplete or
Right.
a poor quality copy.
How do you really know so much about these things?
Well, in 1996, I purchased a perfect moonstone and a part of a sunstone in Illinois and became very interested. And then I started working with historians at the church who were aware of their stone. We call it sometimes the Sunstone Graveyard, a boneyard of stones that they had in a field in Nauvoo, a field in woods in Nauvoo.
Yeah, so the LDS Church doesn't have one of their own original, one of those three. They're just borrowing one from the state.
Correct.
But they have this boneyard of them.
Right.
All right, tell us what we're looking at.
This photo was taken, and I have thousands of photos, but this particular photo was taken in February of 2000. And you can see where there's a pile of stones covered by snow, but there's a fresh pile of stones because they're doing the excavation for the new Nauvoo temple. And so they're finding more stones underground.
Like the Sunstones?
Sunstones and moonstones and
pieces. They were buried there that whole time?
Mm-hmm.
The stones that had been the original Nauvoo temple.
So they found that, digging that up? Nobody knew that was under there?
Correct.
And then they're like, hey, we're busy building the temple. Let's just stick all that over here in this
and they always had, they've done a lot of landfill. This isn't all of the Nauvoo temple ruins. They've done, of course, first of all, the temple was salvaged. There were people selling new stone off of the temple site for decades.
Yeah.
And that Carians built a schoolhouse in the 1850s, and that was still the Nauvoo Visitor Center in the 1970s, 120 years later. And the church bought that and turned it into their visitor center, and then eventually tore it down and built a new visitor center. So all that stone went into the field. Any nice pieces with carvings on them went into the field. The other stone was used immediately for landfill. But eventually they were going to just use all of it for landfill. They just didn't see anything that was nice enough.
How's that possible? You dig up, there's only 3 in existence. You dig some up, and they're just like landfill.
There's no value in history or appreciation.
Well, you have to understand the mission of the church. The mission of the church is saving ordinances, eternal ordinances. That's the mission of the temple. So as they're building a new temple in Nauvoo, and they want a visitor center that represents what the purposes are of the temple, their gospel purposes. And a sunstone is already complicated to talk about and explain to a visitor who's not a church member, or even a visitor who is a church member and is going on this pilgrimage to Nauvoo. You have to explain to them what a sunstone is. And then you have to explain to them that this thing used to be a sunstone, the defaced one. It's complicated.
Right.
It's too far removed. It's a couple of steps removed from their story. But still, to us, we do that when we go to Egypt or when we go to Greece or when we go to Rome. We look at defaced, damaged art objects. We look at the Colosseum.
Huge. Millions of people.
And we understand somebody can explain that the Colosseum used to be
more
filled out, but now it's partially destroyed.
Right.
But their attitude was that these stones had no displayable value.
Yeah.
They have said that there was no displayable value in the stones.
Here's the next photo.
That's a star stone on the bottom of that stack of stones. You can't see it. They've got 4 stones sitting right on the face of a star that was on the frieze of the Nauvoo temple, going around the very top of the Nauvoo temple, and they just stacked them up.
That is unbelievable.
Because then it's all like rubble. It's
the historical preservation of these artifacts is not our priority. Is kind of
so I'm seeing these stones, and I'm trained well enough to understand that these are star stones and sunstones and moonstones that I'm looking at.
And you're freaking out because these aren't in existence, and they've got a bunch of them just sitting there.
Right. They have the only 4 star stones in existence, and they're abandoned in a field like this. And 4 sunstones and a couple of moonstones. So I worked out a deal with President Hinckley to save them, and he let me.
And he said, okay. Because you asked nicely?
I asked nicely.
If anyone had come in and said, I want these things, they would have been like, go ahead.
Right.
But you were first because you understood.
They knew me, and we were doing trades in art and artifacts and art-related artifacts. So.
Okay.
Well, they didn't just give them to you anyway.
Okay. here's the next one.
And so these, when I saw them here in February of 2000, although I had seen these also on, they had them stacked on pallets and had the pallets stacked on top of the faces of these. But can you look at that? Would you know that that's a sunstone? That's a sunstone laying in the snow.
Just because I just barely looked at those pictures a little bit from the bottom.
Right. So
But
I
otherwise,
spotted
no.
that these were sunstones and
That's
moonstones and
unbelievable.
starstones.
Okay, here's another one.
That's another starstone. And you can see tell by the chamfering.
Wait, is that
along
star
the
about
edges.
as big as the sun is?
It is.
So they're similar size. Okay.
That starstone is 4.5 feet tall, and a sunstone is 5 feet tall, maybe a little more than 5,
Okay.
6 feet wide.
Tell us what's going on here.
So they let me go in and get the starstones
After 25 years.
25 years later.
Right.
So, we hit some snags, and the lawyers got involved, and there were people that didn't want me to have the stones after President Hinckley said I could.
Okay, so there's some people that understood the significance of these things.
Right. And it took
Wow.
us 25 years to get it ironed out. And
Wow.
eventually President Nelson gave the okay for me to go ahead and get the stones. And here we are getting them.
So all these people in the picture understand the importance of this moment?
Yes.
Okay. That's
The
awesome.
fellow with the umbrella is a church official. The other people are hired by me, and I'm doing the work.
Wait, that wasn't just like for the photo. You were actually.
No, this is me actually covered in mud.
Okay.
And my children.
Is that whole field all artifacts,
Yes.
basically?
Yeah.
That is unbelievable. And how much of that did you get?
I got my choice of 20 stones.
And how many total would you say there were?
Hundreds, thousands.
What happened to the rest of them?
I imagine they eventually pushed them into the Mississippi like they planned.
There's nobody else that wanted them? Like I could have
I don't
said,
know.
hey, I want those.
They're
or
making a visitor center now that is going to display
some.
their
Okay.
best temple stones.
Okay, what's going on in this photo?
This is actually a star stone
Okay.
covered in mud and chips of rock with a star on its face.
And you're shrink wrapping it.
I'm getting ready to shrink wrap it. We've dug it out. And
When
I'm
they
shrink
moved
wrapping.
them over into the field, was there damage?
Oh,
from the
sure. Yeah,
equipment?
they're damaged. Mhm. Yeah, they were just pushing them around with bulldozers,
Yeah, that's super
front end
sad.
loaders. It was more important
And
that they cut split rail fences for their replica fences than it was that they saved the stones.
So there's constant movement in and out of this area where
I
we
see.
have the stones and forklifts always.
So this is the Starstone.
This is
Totally
the starstone,
shrink
right?
wrap. Just
Again,
as a
there were 4
preservation.
sunstones, 4 starstones, and 2 moonstones, but this is one of the starstones.
I
This was
see.
one of the farthest back. We had to use different techniques on each one. This particular one had to be dug out of the mud. Other ones were
Yeah.
a little more accessible, but this one was one of the exciting ones.
How did you pick 20? Like, did you plan that out for a long
Well,
time?
I got all the sunstones, all the moonstones, and all the starstones. So I
Okay.
knew exactly
Well, that
what I
makes
wanted,
sense.
but-
So, of course. Okay.
And we
Tell
built
us
these
what's
Indiana
happening.
Jones kind of crates. I built those crates myself.
Is that right?
I had to make 20 crates like that, and we brought 3
John
rider
built the
trucks.
crates.
We brought the
And that's
3 trucks up full of. We brought 3 trucks up full of empty crates and put
Yeah.
the stones in the crates.
All right. What are we looking at here?
That's me and my children with the Nauvoo temple behind us. They helped me. They drove trucks. They did everything with me.
And I'm assuming that they feel the same way about these artifacts as you do.
Absolutely, sure.
Yeah.
And there, the trucks are loaded. We have all 20 crates in the trucks, and the 3 of us drive the 3 trucks home.
And when was this that all of this went
These-
down?
We finally got the stones in March of 2021. Wow. And then took them to my house.
And that's all the unloading. I mean, they're not light, I'm guessing. They're super heavy, each of the stones.
Tons each.
Yeah. So, where are they today? What are you doing with them? What's the
They're
story?
about to be displayed in this house to all of my friends.
Mm-hmm. And did you do anything to preserve them or restore them, or it's exactly the way that you found them?
Temperature and humidity control is extremely important because ice getting into the fissures of the stone,
Mm.
expands and shrinks and expands and shrinks through the winter and cracks limestone.
I see. I mean, that is an incredible story on many levels. Some of the takeaways for me are, I don't know how you pulled this off. That is astounding because even if the leaders of the church didn't exactly value those, I bet there's a ton of members of any of the churches that would have just absolutely done whatever they could to preserve those. So I'm glad that
It was a
I'm glad that you
fight
got
to
'em.
preserve them. I was fighting against their will to put them in the Mississippi River or into a ravine.
Right.
It was more
So
about that than
this is an important example of different ways of how people view artifacts. Again, they restore them and they restore them to something that doesn't even look like the original with the smile and whatnot. And the originals, they were just going to get rid of them. Is there anything that you've discovered on those stones that we didn't know before, perhaps?
there is, and I'm still working on it.
Okay, so one day you'll tell us about that. Well, we can't wait to hear about it. So I hope everybody understands that John is the expert here. So every time I've found some sort of an artifact that I think is important to church history, I take it to John. Most of the time he shoots me down and is like, that's not what you think it is. Which is fine because you know me, right? I just want the truth. I don't want it flowered. I don't want it, I don't want the restored version. I want the real, exactly how it is. And so it was very important to me when I made this discovery that I had this conversation with you, and you can shoot me straight. Okay. If you don't agree with what I've found, then you can just say that because your opinion's important to me. But I want to show you, okay? So before I do that, we have to get a little bit into the background history of the death masks. So we've had the death masks for a long time, and people have drawn their conclusions from those, but they really didn't play a part in the martyrdom, trying to figure out what happened in the martyrdom until in the 90s when the RLDS Church released those photos of the skulls. Then between those death masks and those skulls is where all sorts of new ideas were coming, potentially about the martyrdom that nobody had thought of before. So originally, when Joseph Smith and Hyrum were martyred in 1844, within a few days, it's George Cannon that was allowed to make the mold of their faces.
Next day, right?
And we don't know if he is the one that took that mold and poured the plaster into it to make these masks, or if it was William Rowley that did that. We don't know when that happened.
We think William Rowley because he was a plasterer and he ended up in possession of them.
Yeah, so he got them that year. He got the molds and he had the masks at that time. And then he kept those for a couple of years and then sold them to Philo Dibble. And Philo Dibble is the one that took them around. You probably know all of this.
Sure,
And
Philo Dibble paid $100, but Brigham Young was trying to get them at the same time, the same year.
oh, I didn't know that.
Brigham Young was trying to get them in 1849.
So Philo Dibble, that's what became the name of these masks, is the Dibble masks, because he's the one that was most associated with them.
And they really should be called a Cannon, Rowley, Dibble mask.
Something like that. I agree with you, but today if you go into the Church History Museum where they're kept, you'll see the Dibble masks, and that's why.
And there's some evidence that Cannon's son, David H. Cannon, worked on those masks
Also,
with William Rowley.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So as the story goes, Philo had showed them to everybody he was going to show them to, and then he gave them to James Henry Brown. That was 1885. And then Wilford Wood picked them up in 1936. And I don't know if you knew Wilford, but you knew of he has a museum.
He died in 68, so I didn't know him. But
Yeah.
James Henry Brown, they called him Harry, is an important part of the story because he was an artist. And he is the sculptor of most of the headstones, tombstones in Cache County in Logan. And they're still in business. So they made headstones for 175 years.
Wow.
And he and his son, it's hard to actually tell whether it was he or his son that bought that mask, those two masks in 1885.
Yeah,
But by the
it's
way, they paid $50. So
yeah.
Philo Dibble lost money. He bought them
Well,
for
no,
100.
wasn't he charging the whole time for
Oh, I
showing
know,
them? So
but
yeah,
yes.
he was like he got
But he
what he
bought them
wanted.
for 100 in 1849 and sold
Yeah.
them for 50 in 1885, allegedly.
Yeah.
Now, my question for you is, how do you know that that story that we get from Wilford Wood is accurate?
The story of what him getting them from James Henry
The
Brown.
provenance of him getting from James Henry Brown, but how do we know that James Henry Brown had the original Dibble masks?
So I thought there was actually a sales receipt from Dibble to Brown. Have you seen that?
I've seen it.
Yeah.
I've seen a
So
facsimile of it.
that one's very well documented, that exchange. And I think there's the same
But
between.
how do we know Dibble only had one copy?
So, well, we don't. But we assume that he did because back then, when you made a mold and then made a mask from that mold, you had to destroy the mold in order to pull the mask out of it. So if he made more than one mold, then it would be possible. But everyone doubts that would be the case because he didn't have enough time. They were preparing the bodies to be shown. So my feeling is he only made one mold, and that mold was lost or it was destroyed when they pulled the mask out of it. Do you agree with that, or do you see that differently?
No, I agree. It took, it didn't take quite as long as some people have said to let that mold set, that plaster set in just a few minutes, but they put it on layers. So they would do a first layer that would collect the finer details, and then they would strengthen the mask by adding layers, sometimes even with gauze.
Yeah, my understanding is you have to leave it on the face for at least an hour.
It's also possible they used beeswax. We don't
For
know.
the mold. Oh, that would be interesting.
Right. So there's a lot we don't know. I'm bothered that the Dibble masks actually, the so-called Dibble masks actually don't have as much detail as a first generation. It would really be a second generation because the mold is a first generation negative, and then the mask is a second generation positive, and there should be more detail in these masks.
So do you think that was because the mold was not good, or they just weren't good? Whoever actually made
don't
the
know
plaster.
if these aren't copies that are made in the 19th century, because I've now been collecting photographs of masks that are made there's photographs of the masks as early as 1886, and in 1947, 1906, there's photographs of these masks that have been made at different times, and I'm not convinced that the photographs that I'm seeing are photographs of this pair of masks.
Ah, interesting. Well, why didn't you bring those? Because now I would be able to look at them and tell pretty quickly. So that's interesting detail we'll have to continue to look in. But I thought the provenance was pretty good on these masks, where they came from.
Wilford Wood worked with a lot of folk objects that aren't always what Wilford Wood said they were.
Yeah. So these particular masks, I think in the 1950s, made the first copies of them to put on Joseph and Hyrum's tombstones in Nauvoo, and those were bronzed. And so we know he had them at least at that point. But then interestingly, so he died in 1969, but before that, he allowed Steve Glenn, who was an artist in Provo, to make copies of them. And so he made the copies for the tombstones, but I think those molds, no one knows where those are, so they were most likely destroyed in the making of the tombstone. But he allowed Steve Glenn to make a mold. And he told him, Steve wanted to make copies.
I don't think Steve Glenn was around in 69.
So I don't know when
He's just 10 years older than I am.
No, Steve Glenn is not still alive.
I know.
Okay. No, he is. I have an article on the Joseph Smith history page where they have the letter from Steve Glenn talking about how he got that mold, or was able to make
70s?
molds of
these. He didn't
these.
get it from the family in the 1970s?
I don't think so. From what I read, it was he made a deal with Wilford Wood to make those copies. But Wilford made him promise that he would never sell them. He said these are not for money. So Steve, the copies he made, gave them to like the First Presidency, Quantum 12, people like that. Then Steve passes away. Before he passes away, he gives the molds he made to Wayne J. Lewis, which I don't know what he made those out of, but clearly they could be used multiple times. I thought most molds today, once you use it once, you destroy it in order to pull whatever you're making the copy out of. But there's material you could use multiple times. So, and then Wayne Lewis passed away. So where are those molds today? Nobody knows. But in 1990, that's when the Woods family, Woods' two daughters, donated the masks to the church. And they put them on display immediately, but first thing they did was make some restorations. As you can see, all of the white on there was added by the church. I've reached out to as many people as I can who had anything to do with those masks and that saw them before him, to ask why was there a problem with the chin, Hyrum's chin, before they gave him to the church? And they say no. So I don't know why the church did that.
Well, you're aware that Joseph's chin is cracked too, right?
So I know that there's a crack in it, but they didn't do that to it.
No, they glued Joseph and patched Hyrum, but that glue on Joseph's chin appears in the 1886 photograph.
Okay, so why was Hyrum's already repaired? I thought they didn't do that till 1990. So was it the Woods?
I don't have the church records, so I wasn't even sure. I agree with all of your dates up there, but I was not aware of the 1990 date.
Yeah.
I knew the Wood family still had them as late as 1978. So I don't have any insider information about.
So I've seen a reference as well that said they gave it to the church in 1980, but the church's site says 1990.
Yeah, I know.
So I'm just going with that date.
One of those sales went through the widow of one of these gentlemen.
James Henry Brown's widow.
Okay. Is that right? Like you've seen that document? Great.
So
good detail.
So right, I'm relying only on Mark Staker, who's the LDS Church historic sites.
Do you know
curator.
Mark Staker?
Oh yeah, he's one of my very favorite Mormon historians.
So I think he would know this story because he was around at that time.
Oh yes, he would know.
Well, you've got to put us in touch.
Oh, I would.
To get the story of why did you do that to Hyrum?
He's one of the people who understands Mormon history for sure. The Joseph Smith period, the early period in Vermont and in Pennsylvania, and understands curating and historic sites.
That's great.
He's
I'm glad to hear he has the right way of looking at that. So again, these two death masks are an important artifact, but as far as all of the new ideas about the martyrdom and what happened at Carthage, the wound on Hyrum's nose has always been important, but the real breakthrough again was when the RLDS Church in the 90s released those pictures of the skulls that were taken of Joseph and Hyrum in the 1920s.
Sure, they amplify each other.
Okay, so this is the back of both skulls, Joseph and Hyrum. And what you'll notice, and we want to talk about this as respectfully as possible because it's Joseph and Hyrum, of course, but there is zero damage to these skulls. There is no exit wound. And according to the official narrative, Hyrum was shot through the nose and under the chin, and there is zero damage on the top or in the back. And I've done enough testing on this at all different calibers with all different powers of weapons to know even if there's not an exit, there will be cracking. Like if somehow the ball stays inside the skull, there will be cracking, and there is nothing like that. This photo is why the Lyon brothers started their examination, because they were both hunters, or they both at least understood guns, and they said, something's not right here. So they're the ones that came up with that theory that the nose shot and the chin shot were a through shot. It was one shot instead of two. And that's why there's no exit wounds, if that makes sense. But they said the entrance was through the nose and the exit was through the chin. And this is where I come into the story. It's because I've spent so much time looking at these skulls and death masks. And what I noticed on Hyrum, as you can see here, the wound comes pretty far over on his face. So that was probably caught in a rag or something like that, that they stuck in the wound when they made that mold. But that wound comes over really far. It's not just the side of the nose. And so if you look at the photo of Hyram's skull, there is no damage to the ridge of his nose there. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
So how can there be a wound over this part, but there's no hole in his skull or no cracking in his skull right there? So that's how I knew that it was not the entry, it was the exit. So the exit came through the nose, and oftentimes that makes a flap of skin. So on the exit out, because the exit hole is usually bigger than the entry, it would have ripped that wound or the skin off of the skull in that spot. Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
Now, every single mask that anybody has is all a copy from that Dibble mask. All of them. And
we don't know that, right?
I'd say we don't know that with 100% certainty.
We should almost be calling this the wood mask.
So no, it's the Dibble. This is the Dibble mask. This is the one that's in the museum.
But we don't know that it's the Dibble mask. It's traditionally identified as the Dibble mask, but it was really the wood mask. It's the mask that the Wood family donated. It's a pair of masks that the Wood family donated.
Got it.
That we believe is the set of masks that were owned by the Brown family, which we believe is the set of masks they got from Dibble. But there's other possibilities. The Brown family was working on sculptures of Brigham Young and Joseph Smith. It's hard to tell where these masks trade back and forth. They allege they acquired them in 1885 from Philo Dibble, but we also, and it's very specific, by the way, it's November 21st, 1885. They know exactly when they got these from Dibble, but in 1886, there's a set of death masks in the possession of Brigham Young, and they're not the pedestal masks. There are other masks around already at that time period.
I didn't know about
that
those
are not
masks.
The Dibble masks.
Where are those?
Or not the pedestal masks, not the ones traditionally. Well, we don't know. And so when we try to ascertain which is the earliest example, we could be fairly certain that the masks traditionally identified as the Dibble masks are more detailed than the masks we call the pedestal masks, but we can't actually tell whether they're the first. We just know that this one is earlier than that one.
Okay, so
it could be that someday something surfaces that was earlier.
Let's get into that, because you bring up a great point. These are taken from the church's website. They allowed 3D modeling.
Yeah.
So if you have a 3D software, you can pull these up and look at them from any angle. And I took that from here so that you could see the extensive repairs or restoration that they did. And just like you, well, maybe not like you, I consider this the earliest copy. I understand your questions, but do you say
This is the
there is
earliest known copy, but we don't know if it was the earliest copy or if it's the earliest extant copy. We just know it's the earliest known extant copy.
Okay. So what I do from all the other masks is I look at the marking on these, but for here, you can see again extensive on the chin, and it came up the side here, and there was a little bit done in the hair. And here you can see on the left side of Hyram's face that wound, the famous wound. Okay, and now we're going to bring up the copy that, or the version that you're talking about, which is the pedestal mask. And the pedestal mask as far as I understand, doesn't show up in the record until 1930, in the possession of Joseph F. Smith. And it's Staker's theory that the pedestal mask was a copy of the Dibble mask, and John Taylor is the one that commissioned that or did it so that he could send it to England and an artist could make the busts
Sure,
of
in
Joseph and Hyrum.
1850. Sure, in 1850 they made busts in England. Lucius Gahagan, Gahagan, made some really beautiful sculptures of both Joseph and Hyrum. And it's probable that historians have typically conjectured that is the origin of the pedestal masks. But the church, all the way through that period, from the 1880s at least through the 1940s, has had in its possession masks that did not have pedestals on them. So when were the pedestals put on, or are there two sets of masks in the church's possession before they acquired the wood masks?
Great questions.
The chins aren't the same.
So what I wanted to explain on this one is, on the pedestal you can see all of these very distinct markings on it that don't exist on the dibble. You can see the distinct markings that don't exist on the pedestal. And the chins are very different, and that's because the church did those repairs, and Staker in his article says the guy that did that didn't have access to this pedestal mask.
How can that be if they owned them both?
You tell me.
And I think maybe own another set they've forgotten about.
Yeah, you tell me. I don't know. That's part of the mystery, but what I'm thinking is, if he commissioned these for a sculpture, that if the pedestal mask is a copy of the dibble, when they pulled it out, they smoothed over the marks, because there's no marks on this thing.
They probably have, because I have photos of these masks with more marks than on the smooth pedestal mask today. So there's either another set of masks or this. And by the way, that was common. Even right after creating the positive images, they would smooth them and sand them and
and
shape them up.
This one's known, the pedestal mask is known that Hyrum has a cleft in his chin. And so a lot of people think that's probably what would be under this dibble plaster would be a cleft.
The problem is I have some evidence that the masks were actually made in two pieces, the mold. And so that cleft could actually be a result of there being two molds and blending the molds together before making the positive.
So I'm looking at every photo of Hyrum that I can, or a picture of Hyrum, to see if he has that cleft in the chin. But a lot of them are the sideway profiles, so that's not exactly helpful.
I brought one with me.
There aren't any written descriptions of Hyrum having a cleft chin?
So there's one of the early ones that I can see like a dimple at the bottom, but never a full cleft. So I'm like, again, is that the most accurate? Is that, or did the artist add that in, after the fact? Or is there a cleft under that plaster piece of the dibble? I don't know.
They can't do a scan that
I think they could.
That ignores the new material.
I think they could, and that's precisely one of the things that I want them to do. Let me pull up this photo so you can see what John was talking about. The pedestal mask is called the pedestal mask because of this big lump of plaster on the back of it, which was probably for presentation purposes. But if they took all of the marks off of Hyrum, they definitely left the wound to his nose, which is curious. But can you see other than all of the markings, what's the biggest difference?
Chin.
It's the chin. So you can see how it declines. And here it's straight. So whoever did this restoration was not following that at all, or they had something else in mind when they were doing it. But it's like, so most people say the pedestal mask is the most accurate version of Hyrum's chin, because it was created before the dibble mask was restored. Does that make sense?
So you can see the change in the detail in the hair.
Uh-huh.
And I believe that a second generation positive, the first positive made, should have even more detail, because descriptions from that time period of this process say that you can pick up, the, the your fingerprint in the plaster. I mean, you can pick
It's
up
good
your
enough to pick
wrinkling,
that detail
your
up.
wrinkling, and there's very, very little
Yeah.
wrinkling, maybe just a
So
smile around the eyes.
John's talking about, you can see the hair detail here that's just not in the pedestal version.
But I think there should be an earlier mask that has even more detail.
I don't know. But if there is, and the church has it, obviously I want to see that as soon as possible. But there's other versions out there. And all of the versions that I've found, every single one of them has this slope on the chin, which tells me they're most likely Wood's copies. They're copies of the dibble that Wood had when that guy took it and made a copy of it and handed out versions to people. None of them have this straight chin, which makes sense because my understanding is once that was donated to the church and they repaired it, they've never allowed anybody to copy that again. They've allowed people to come in and look at it and study it, photograph it, 3D image it, but never copy it again. And to my knowledge, the pedestal mask has never been allowed to be copied since the church has owned it in 1930, which makes, or that's the earliest reference to it, but if they've owned it since John Taylor, whatever. Anyway, so all of the versions, the copies I've seen are all, they have that sloping chin. So that's the first thing I can tell to say, oh, this is a Woods mask, because it's not a pedestal, but it was before they gave it to the church, to where the chin's different now.
Also, his brow's different.
The brow is just detail. Like,
no, I think this brow,
It comes out in the one on the right.
Wait, tell me what you're
this
saying.
brow here is more pronounced, and the hook on the nose on that one is more pronounced.
Okay, that could be because of the angle of the 3D.
I know.
I can't.
But it can also be because they sanded the pedestal mask when they made it to
maybe
smooth it. You can see the imperfections in it. You can see in some photographs air bubbles and things. It just feels like something you made in grade school out of plaster in some ways.
Yeah, you could see the thickness here, but you can also see all of this is different than on the pedestal. So it was clearly, it wasn't just a thin cover of something. It was pretty heavy reconstruction. So let's look at the other versions, because that could just be the way, the angle that I chose.
It could just be a 1 degree difference. Made that disappear.
So this version is a known copy of a Wood copy. So you can still see some of the identifiable marks. The one that I find the easiest is, I call it the horseshoe, is this with this circle. These 3 along this eye are so easy to spot.
This actually has more detail than the pedestal mask.
It's way more. So again, that's why I'm like, okay, if the pedestal mask is a copy of the dibble mask, then they must have smoothed it over and made it look nice.
That's what I think.
Or something like that. That's what I think happened too. But this version, you can kind of see some of those markings. This is a big determinant marking above his brow here, that little circle in this. That kind of got washed out. This big mark on the nose, this one could have been a little bit damaged. So this particular mask is an example that we know is a copy of a copy, which means you can see how the details fade as you get deeper into the copies. So it is a Wood mask because if you turn it sideways, you see the slope in the chin. But it's not the best as far as detail. So this next one's very interesting. So this bronze version is actually listed on eBay for sale for $4,500. And I've reached out to them and I said, I'm interested, but I need more photos.
Is this a fellow in Idaho?
I don't know. But I can't, he said he'll send more photos, but I want to be able to see the detail from all of the different angles before I would be interested in it. But so this is important to realize. All of the masks, if you made them out of plaster, are going to be white. So, but very few are white because they painted something on them, either for looks or for protection, because the plaster, as it dries out, would begin to flake off and whatnot, and you can't handle them and without causing damage. So whoever had this copy painted it with this bronze, which is cool, but I'm like, ooh, that one causes damage to the historical nature of it. In my opinion, I think it buried a bunch of the detail, but you can still see the horseshoe mark, and you can still see that mark, or faintly the eyebrow mark here. But someday I would like to get pictures of that and compare other, and look at the wound. It's like the edges became more sharp rather than rounded by this process of bronzing it.
Detail on the chin is like, it's amazing how much detail the chin has.
Right? Well, that's how you know it wasn't made from this, which in my opinion, this is a wood copy. The chins all look alike, and it has enough of the details that I would say, yeah, that came from a copy of the Dibble. Okay, next one. Now here, this is a white copy that has tremendously good detail. Best white I've seen, which tells me, so it hasn't, nobody's painted that protective layer on it. And it tells me that this is a wood mask. This is a first generation wood mask. Look at the detail here. You can very clearly see those marks. You can see the mark on the nose. You can see the eyebrow mark very easily. This is an excellent copy. So I was like, okay, very cool. Here's the next copy. This one is a little crazy looking because that either they mixed gray and green paint in with the plaster, or they painted it afterwards this color, and it makes it look a little creepy to me. But nevertheless, it's an incredibly important historical piece.
Well, it's great to photograph. They've filled in with a stain is what they've done, which is accentuate the low spots in the details by filling them in dark, which makes it photograph incredibly well.
Yeah, you
and
can
really
see
the so-called Dibble.
There's the horseshoe.
Sure.
You can see the eyebrow really good. You can see the nose marks. I mean, this one's got all the hallmarks from
What
the
do you conjecture
Dibble.
is the reason for the yellowing of the first mask? Do you know that story?
This one? Okay. So Staker assumes it's because the pedestal mask was made from it, and they put that on so that it would release.
He believes it's varnish. And I think it's possibly, if this is a first generation, it could be actually olive oil, it could be wax, it could be, when I say first generation, I mean the first positive image, which would be second generation. But
yeah, I don't think it was meant for, hey, we want it to be this color.
No, I think that needs to be analyzed to find out if that's wax, because it will help prove that that's the first
one
mask. If we can identify that as wax, it might help inform our study, or if we can identify it as olive oil or varnish, I think it helps the story of figuring out what was made from it and what it was made from.
And to date it.
Yeah.
To date it.
So there are people who are, they think it was made from the limestone from the Temple Quarry.
And it can't be. And the reason is plaster of Paris does not have lime in it.
And
Mark Staker thinks that there's powdered limestone in the mask, but plaster of Paris is made from calcium sulfate dihydrate.
Okay.
And so it's gypsum. Gypsum is not made from lime, and limestone would not have set fast enough. So this gypsum is plaster that's used by William Rowley is the only thing you can use that will set almost in minutes, but probably getting closer to a half hour or longer to be able to pull that off. And as they say, there was a rush. They probably could only make one, but we're just guessing that they could have made more than one.
It's possible. Agreed.
I would have stayed up all night and made a dozen, and
a few
of them would be around today. There's always a risk when you make that kind of an image and having
Right.
it survive when there's only one. So,
Right.
so we don't actually know, but
Okay.
but it is not limestone from the Nauvoo Temple Quarry.
So the other reason that this mask is interesting is because new marks show up on it.
Fascinating.
So and those look like, at earlier because the stain covers them.
Mhm.
So where would marks like that come from? I don't know. Those are very curious marks, but that happens a lot in the masks. And I would guess there's variability. Even if you're using one mold and make 10 masks from it, they'll probably all look just a little bit different. There's enough indicators to know it's a wood copy.
It
but-
could be something as simple as how that plaster is moving in the mold.
Or right afterwards, they accidentally touched it or
Mhm.
something and put those marks. Yeah, you never know.
With
Okay.
Air bubbles and
So not too long ago,
Dust.
so these masks are all really cool. Not too long ago, Steve actually referred me to a guy that had a piece that I was very interested in. It was a document from one of the 5 accused guys in Carthage for being part of the conspiracy. And I wanted that document. And so I went and was able to strike a deal with the guy. And I asked him, because he had it for quite a while, I said, why are you willing to sell this? And he said, I need the money. And I know what that means. That means I've got an even bigger, cooler thing that I want. Right? So I was very happy that he was willing to part with that piece. And on the way out, I saw these 2 death masks. And I was like, well, if you need any more, let me know, because I've been wanting some death masks forever. But I didn't want the copies online that are like 100 books that are just like bubbly, and I didn't want those. These ones I thought were excellent quality. So we struck a deal and I was able to purchase these masks. And I came home and immediately started going through them. And I mean, it's got all of the marks. It's got the nose mark. It's got the horseshoe mark, the 3 marks here, has above the lip, has on this side. I mean, it's a really excellent quality wood copy. And then I saw the thing that made my jaw drop.
wow.
I don't know if the camera can see that. But right there on the mask is a mark that's very curious, because we know that Hyrum was shot below the chin. And I saw that and was freaking out. Oh my gosh, there it is. There's the mark on the mask. And I'm, of course, asking myself, how is it possible nobody knew about this? And it's because you wouldn't know about it if you're only looking at that. They covered it up.
They literally covered it up.
This is what we're talking about today. Quit doing that.
Right.
Because you never know when there's going to be a discovery
Right.
that you need to verify. So we don't know what's under that chin. And I don't know if that's just a variation on the mask that I have. And so I immediately start trying to find other masks. That's why I have all of these photos. And because I'm like, if none of them have that, then it's just this mask. There's a mistake.
They did it intentionally to rewrite this to ensure that
I'm not ready to say that. I'm not ready to say that, but it's pretty suspect. Why does that look better than if the chin was falling apart, just gluing it, or whatever you're talking about with Joseph? Why wouldn't they have done that? So it's super suspect that they did that. But before I'm going too crazy, I'm like, okay, how do I know that, that's not just my mask? So I was able to get another copy. This is a gray copy. Beautiful detail. All the hallmarks, the horseshoe, the 3, the nose, the eyebrow, all of the hallmarks. And then you can see when I freaked out.
Yep.
It's there! The same mark on at least 2 versions of the mask. So I do not know that this is the gunshot wound. I don't even know exactly how I would verify that. And that mark could just be a crack that leads to another. Maybe that mark is the reason why they repaired it. And who knows what that mark is. But I'm finding this to be super suspicious. So I'm finding anyone that has a mask, send me your mask so I can look at it. And so that's why I have all those masks. Here you can see the examples. This is that green-gray one, same mark. So yeah, this white one, it's not pronounced, but the faint outline is there. This is my tan one, and this is my gray one, and they're just screaming out at me.
Fantastic photography. Good job.
Thanks, man. Now, here's where it gets interesting. I brought 3.
So the white one has less detail in the nostril, but the other ones all have a bunch of detail in the nostril.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's still quite a bit of detail there, which tells me originally when you made the mold, when you poured the plaster in it, that's why you destroyed the mold, is the nostrils would be locked in. So you pull it out, it would break it. Anything that's like too deep of a detail causes problems. So the pedestal mask, you don't see the detail in the nostril, which is precisely why I think it was a copy of the dibble, is because they couldn't do the nose, or they would have had to break the dibble to pull the model off, if that makes sense. So anyway, these are 3 different calibers of balls.
54.
Wait, what are you saying?
54.
Nope, that's 69.
Oh, 69. This is 54.
That's 54.
What is that, about a 22?
That's a 32.
Oh, 32. Wow.
So the way that the martyrdom narrative is told by Willard, it was muskets pointing, shot through the door, pointing through the door. So that is that ball. If you compare that to the side of his nose, you can say, yeah, that's possible on the sizing. But compare it to the chin, there's no way that ball caused
well, they
that.
flatten, right? And it could have gone through a door first.
No, not the chin shot. The door shot through the panel supposedly is this wound.
Right.
This one was a straight-on shot that Willard says grazed his chest. That's where the rip in his vest comes.
From where?
From through the door. So somebody would have had to been on the floor shooting a parallel shot.
Or on the stairs. Mm-hmm.
Maybe, yeah. But anyway, not only is there no X's, but you can see here, it's not at all close to being this size. Now, Sam Weston's theory is that it was by pistols, 54 caliber pistols, and that's why there's no exit wounds. It's because it was a lower caliber. That's not true. I've shot plenty of things with the 54 caliber. It's very powerful and caused damage to the skull. But I hold the 54 up to it. It's much larger. It's still too big. Now I hold up the 32 caliber, and why is that significant? Because that's the size that would come out of a 6-shooter, out of those pepper boxes. And now you can see, if this holds true, do you understand? This is evidence that it was a small caliber shot under the chin.
Would the 32 do that kind of damage coming out to the nose?
Yes, absolutely. And that wound, because it's the exit, would be bigger. So Sam postulates that you can't tell the difference between the 2 wounds. And everyone I talked to is like, of course you can tell the difference, which is why the coroner and the doctor both said they mentioned the throat wound and not the nose wound. So what I think we have potential evidence of, and we need to obviously do a lot more study, is the wound under Hyrum's chin that shows it was small caliber.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think that means?
Well, I would ask why there wouldn't be. We know he was shot under the chin. So if that's not the wound, where is the wound?
Mm-hmm. So that's another good point. You can tell by the 2 masks the depth. Can you see how Joseph's is very shallow?
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't put the model on too far. He pushed it way back on Hyrum's head, which would make sense. He would do that if he wanted to capture the wound.
Capture the wound. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So I don't know, John. I don't know how to prove it. All I know is that wound's there on the Woods copies and it's not on the one that the church has. And they plastered over that dang thing. And I'm so upset. Like, let us x-ray it so we can see what's under there. Because if that mark is under there, I'm going to be like, that is powerful evidence.
Right.
So, okay.
I know nothing about guns, but my gut is that the shot under a chin would have been like at close range.
Mm-hmm. Meaning what?
Someone's like on the floor and or near them when they shoot him through the chin rather than outside of a door and down
Right.
the stairs or something.
Okay. So, I mean, I just had an argument with a historian this week. Not argument, discussion. And after quite some time, he agreed it was a through shot, mainly because Hyrum has 3 other holes in his clothing: the back, the hip, and the knee. And there's at least 4 or 5 different accounts that say he was struck with 4 balls. So if that's true, then 1 shot. So he finally agreed to that, but he would not relinquish that the nose was the exit instead of the entry. He wouldn't give that up. And I mean, I showed him the quotes, I showed him the evidence, I showed him the forensic detectives, I showed him all of this, and he would not give that up because they know the consequence of that.
Mm-hmm.
If it was under the chin, that means the narrative that we have is completely wrong, because whoever did that would have had to been in the room. Most likely would have been behind John holding the gun like this. And you don't...
Self-inflicted.
Could have been, yes, the evidence shows that it could have been self-inflicted, but Hyrum's pistol was a 40 cal. So I think it would have caused more damage than a 6-shooter. And we know from John Hay, there's 2 6-shooters in the room. We know Joseph had one. John says that Joseph had both. One of which we know used to belong to John. He gave it to Cyrus, and then Cyrus brought it into Joseph. So where did the other one come from, and why would Joseph have both and tell John, you just need a cane, and I'm going to have all the firearms? So we have all the evidence. It's there. Now's where it gets kind of crazy. These are the 2 death masks that are the most familiar. Most people, especially if you've researched anything about the martyrdom, know about the death masks. But there was a 3rd death mask, and this one most people don't know existed.
Wow.
You know who that is?
I don't think I've seen that. It looks sort of familiar.
That's Brigham.
So I think I've seen his hands.
Yep. The cast
They
of his
shaved
right
him
hand were
and-
made.
They completely shaved his head and his beard.
Yes. So from what I understand, there's maybe 5 copies of those. The church owns the original, and the Young family has the rest of them. And people don't like to talk about none of the people that own these masks. But I think because of that promise from Wood that you're not supposed to sell them. So anyone that has one and wants to trade it or sell it or whatever, they keep it on the down low. And same thing with that Brigham mask. But John, this is, to my knowledge, the first time publicly that these 3 masks have been
This
displayed
Brigham Young
together.
one is, to my knowledge, not been published and is not available anywhere in any repository or anywhere for anybody to view.
So online Staker says that they own it and maybe one day they'll display it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course I'm like, why are you not displaying it? Why wouldn't people want to see this? And that made me start questioning things. And then I started looking things up. And then I had this faint remembrance of something you said a long time ago, that the rumor is that Brigham Young may have been poisoned rather than died
Right.
from
In
appendicitis.
1877, I don't know a lot about it, but I had a friend, Samuel W. Taylor, Samuel Woolley Taylor, was a historian when I was a young man, and he was a grandson of John Taylor and
Yep.
wrote a number of significant landmark church history books. And one of them was a biography of John Taylor. One was called Nightfall at Nauvoo.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me personally that he thought that his own grandfather poisoned Brigham Young. But I don't know anything about that.
Well, that's interesting. So he wrote an article that he started working on in the 70s. I think it was first published in the 80s, called Who Done It by Samuel Taylor. And like you said, Samuel was the grandson of John Taylor, and he lived from February 5th, 1907 to September 26th, 1997. So his father actually is one that got excommunicated for continuing to practice polygamy, but he stayed a member of the LDS Church and actually went to Brigham Academy and became a famous author. He wrote do you remember the Absent Minded Professor movies?
Mm-hmm.
That was him. He wrote those.
Wow.
And he was a famous historian. And he does a lot of research and writes this article, which is super hard to find online now, trying to figure out who killed Brigham Young.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened was in 1877, there was a conference coming up in October of that year, and the Salt Lake Tribune came out saying what a lot of people were saying, is they felt like Brigham Young was going to abdicate his position as president of the church to his son. And this is the son that was the first son born after the martyrdom that he named John Willard,
Mm-hmm.
which I always thought was suspect. But that son, interestingly, Brigham ordained him an apostle when he was 11 years old. Because at that time, the policy was if you were in the 12, whoever had seniority, whoever became apostle first is the senior member of the quorum. And then when the prophet dies, he becomes the next prophet. So Brigham secretly ordained his son when he was 11. And 10 years later, he ordained his next two sons. Same way. When the 12 found out about it, they're like, you can't do that. What are you doing? You can't secretly ordain people to be apostles. Nowadays, if you ordain an apostle, you're automatically in one of the 12. But then Brigham did that. And he wasn't particularly that healthy. Brigham was. So everyone thought what he was going to do was name his son the president in that conference. And if Brigham said it, and Brigham said, my revelation trumps anything else, then his son would have taken over. So after that article came out, and a month and a few weeks before that conference, Brigham dies. In a really strange way. And there was so much speculation at the time that he had been murdered or, poisoned, that the Deseret News came out with a story and said, no, it was all normal. He ate some green peaches or something like that, or green corn and peaches, and he died from a broken appendix.
It's like the same thing with Alvin, no?
Yes, Alvin Smith in 1825.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Same thing, poisoning. People were getting poisoned all the time back then.
From eating, what was that?
Turnips, green turnips.
Is that what they said about Alvin? I didn't know that. Interesting. So anyway, what the Deseret News printed the last 7 days of his life and what happened on each of those days. And they, let me show you that. So this is the article from the Deseret News on 31st of August.
I own the original of that.
Awesome. I wish you'd brought it. That'd be interesting. Anyway, they say, in order to satisfy the feelings of our many readers and answer numerous inquiries concerning the particulars of the sickness of our late beloved President Brigham Young, published the following. And they have two doctors giving their opinion. Dr. Seymour Young is Brigham's nephew. And this is the last hours, and you can see on the first day, Thursday, August 23rd, his sickness commenced. Continuing the whole of the afternoon, had an inclination to vomit, but he continued to attend to his business as usual. In the evening, he was present at a bishop's meeting in the council house and instructed the brethren in their duties, speaking with marked point and power. Then at 11 that night, he was seized with an attack of cholera morbus, the usual symptoms of vomiting and purging being almost continuous. So, I mean, this guy was retching till 5 o'clock the next morning when he was given a mild opiate. So they do more. And S.W. Taylor, what, you had a question?
Have you researched the incidence of cholera in Salt Lake City and that week, that year?
No.
I mean, this is from unclean water typically. Why would Brigham Young be getting cholera and everyone around in the city isn't getting cholera, or are they? Do you know?
I don't know that. But what I know is S.W. Taylor sent the whole list of symptoms to a bunch of different doctors and said, what do you think this is? And they all unanimously came back and said, anyone that says that's appendicitis is crazy.
Yeah.
The dead giveaway is the massive vomiting, seizing, as it describes in the first day or two. And they'll say that's probably arsenic poisoning.
Nicotine poisoning.
Or some type, I don't know about, they didn't say nicotine, they all said arsenic. Because they have compared all of the cases of people who are arsenic poisoned, and it like follows the symptoms. But one of the things they said is he didn't die right away. He didn't die as fast as other people. So other people might have been continuing to deliver it to him in his food. So
even if Brigham Young was murdered, and you were to conclude, as you believe, John Taylor killed Joseph Smith and Brigham Young then?
So that's the question. Who killed Joseph? Who killed Brigham?
Mm-hmm.
So Taylor makes some theories about who he thinks, but he establishes the motive really well. And the cool thing
John
is...
Taylor or Samuel Taylor?
Samuel, his grandson. I mean, that son, who was one of the 12, would have become the prophet. He was young, but not yet, because there were still guys that had been ordained before him, and they didn't like him. He spent most of his time in New York, did a bunch of businesses that failed and was in horrible debt. When he came back to Salt Lake, Brigham, a year before he dies, puts him in the first presidency.
Sure, yeah, he was in Connecticut, New York, right?
Then makes him his first counselor, and then pays him a huge salary.
Right.
And all the rest of the 12 are like, what are you doing? So his first counselor in his first presidency, that's why everyone was worried. He is in this conference going to hand it over and say, my son's the new prophet. So Brigham dies very curiously. And then after that, that son is still in the running. He's still, an apostle. And after the last guy, or just before the last guy dies, that would put him as the now senior apostle, they changed it.
Oh, interesting.
The first presidency said, all right, now it's according to how long you've been in the quorum of the 12. So because none of them liked him, so they just changed it. Said to be the prophet, this is how it works now. So he, right after, Lorenzo Snow was the fourth, died. He comes back from New York, and they're like, sorry, we changed the rule. So he goes back to New York, and that's where I think he lives the rest of his house. So you have this crazy motive. Nobody liked this guy. Nobody wanted him to be the prophet, and they thought Brigham was going to make him the prophet anyway. So now he shows up dead. And S.W. Taylor says, well, there's a couple of people it could have been. First of all, maybe John Lee. Mountain Meadow Massacre, because Brigham threw him under the bus, there's people that were loyal to John D. Lee that they think maybe they came up and took Brigham out for doing that.
Time period.
Mm-hmm. But S.W. Taylor says they never would have been able to get close enough to him to be able to administer that poison. So the next thing he says is, well, you have to look at who gained the power after Brigham died. Like, right? That's the number one question I asked for Joseph Smith is who had the most to gain by their martyrdom, which is obviously Brigham, and everyone's like, no.
It's also Warsaw. Warsaw has economic rivalry with Nauvoo and future economic rivalry with Nauvoo as there's discussion about a transcontinental railroad and there's steamboat traffic that Warsaw wants.
No doubt. I'm not saying that. I'm saying when you're lining up all of your suspects, you look up who's the next guy in line that takes their position. That's obvious. And yet so many members of the church are like, you can't say that. That doesn't make sense. And I'm like, whatever. But here we have another historian.
Historians need to be like scientists. We can't let our emotions decide who we think killed Joseph Smith. We need to think about it scientifically and work our way through it, looking at the documents and whether they conflict with each other and so on. So, I appreciate that look at John Taylor.
Yeah, so he's honest about saying you have to consider him, but he quickly dismisses his grandpa.
Oh, he does?
And says they were not good friends. Brigham and John were never that good of friends. They didn't spend that much time together. They just did their church duties together. So
that's
he's
the point.
Isn't that ironic?
So you do see some of that. You do see that Brigham Young was isolating John Taylor already.
Yeah. Well, as a matter of fact, Samuel points this out. John Taylor was the head of the Quorum of the 12, but for the last 3 years in conference, Brigham didn't introduce him as the head of the 12. He just introduced him as one of the 12. So he considers that.
But I have accounts from even non-Mormons who are visiting who can sense the tension between John Taylor and Brigham Young, and they talk about it.
Yeah. So again, his grandson in the article dismisses John Taylor as a suspect. And the third one he names is one of Brigham's wives. And he won't name her. And I'm trying to find the wife that fits, but he says she had a 17-year-old daughter that Brigham was trying to trade to a man as a reward, to be a polygamous wife. And the mom did not want that for this 17-year-old daughter. And Brigham didn't care and was going to do it anyway. And so he says that's the number one suspect because this wife would have had access to him and whatnot. So
that's what the police would say.
Right? It's so
Shouldn't
fascinating.
Anyone else just assume that Brigham Young would name his son, who was born after Joseph Smith, that's the only right.
Well,
he does that later.
You do see some people named Joseph Hyrum.
He names them that later, but the first one, and then the first one is John Willard, and the second one is Brigham Jr.
But that isn't necessarily nefarious because they're
John Willard are the two other people who are in with them when Joseph.
It's suspect, killed, right? But it's just a correlation. It's not proof. It's just one piece of evidence amongst.
But it can also be honoring the two people who participated in nearly getting killed.
That's right. I acknowledge that. It could be meaningless.
And they're his friends. So Brigham.
Should be the name of it.
So there's so much more work to do on Brigham's death. And I love his first statement. He's like, with all things, the church says, no, nothing to see here. Everything's fine. He just died from this. But there's a complete opposite side of that. But he says there's many historians that believe that Brigham was murdered. I didn't know that. Does anybody know that? Did they know this death mask existed?
Oh,
I
think that causes pause for many people.
So I wanted to show you one last thing, and we'll be done. There is a printed version of that mask, Brigham's mask. It's in this book.
Oh, it is?
Brigham Young, Images of a Mormon Prophet.
I remember now. I have seen it in there. That's it.
Yeah, you can see it there, and you can see the hand. And the fellow that made it, George M. Ottinger diary, in his diary, he recorded all of the measurements, and he says Brigham was 5'10". That was a big question that no one ever knew Brigham's height.
Well, his obituary doesn't make sense either because they give his height and his weight, and they give his height at 5'10" and his weight at 200 pounds or something, and we think Brigham was a little heavier than that.
His waist was 39, according to this. So, yeah, a lot of people are like, he was a little more portly towards the end of his life.
I have about 50 copies of that book. It's a very, very, very good book. Anna found the earliest known image of Brigham Young.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Awesome.
the earliest
story.
image ever taken in Utah, which was a photo, a daguerreotype of Brigham Young. So it's a really, really useful reference book. Anybody should have a copy of that.
This book shows the mask that the church has for Brigham.
Right.
And I want you to take a real good look at that
Is that Ottinger? Is it the same
and compare it.
the painter?
I do not.
Yes. Savage and Ottinger was the same as.
Okay, look closely at that mask and look at this one.
Well, I can tell the difference already.
What have they done?
Well, they've reshaped it, haven't they?
Here's the big one that jumps out to me. Look at it, the eye. Don't see it?
Like, does he have warts on his eye, or what are you saying?
Yeah.
How do you know that's not an air bubble?
Or a mold or whatever. And there's one here
a
next
mole.
to his nose as well.
Well, there's a few of them. Yeah.
So what has the church
why not?
done?
Because they've cleaned up the nose.
They
Of course,
clean it up.
The smile is deeper.
This is their hero. Their version of the mask, that original, they clean it up to where this is the accurate mask and it shows the flaws. Is this not going along with everything we've been talking about today? That whoever is responsible for this at the Church History Museum has no problem. Hey, let's make this look as good as we possibly can.
Well, it's metaphorical for how the church writes history. If it's the book Saints, the 3-volume set.
Yeah.
You know, they're going to clean up history. They clean up Nauvoo. Nauvoo in the 1840s was shanties and sticks and dugouts, and only the most prominent members of the church had the finer brick homes, and there were a lot of smaller brick homes and wood frame homes, but those deteriorated, and the best houses that survived are the apostles' house. It's not that the church saved John Taylor's or somebody saved John Taylor's house and Willard Richard's house and Parley Pratt's house. They were the best houses, and they've survived.
Why don't they have? Why
And-
don't they have the way the majority of the people lived? Why haven't they replicated the mud dugout huts or
Well,
the
worse, they've
shanties?
they've created replica houses that aren't representative of the houses that were there at the time.
Well, we have identified a lot of evidence today to suggest that they care more about making a good image today than respecting the history. Whatever it is, good or bad.
But
here
who
it
is they? There's some very good historians there. There's some
Whoever
very
is
good
in
people.
charge of these artifacts.
There are
About the
people.
temple.
Who?
There are people that care about the temple in that organization, that care about the
I agree.
preservation, that didn't want the Logan Temple gutted in the 70s, that didn't want, most recently, the Salt Lake Temple gutted, that didn't want the Ogden and Provo
Yeah.
temples torn down. There are people that care, that are just like me, that work in that organization, that fight every day, that just can't
Well, I agree with that.
sway.
But those aren't the
decision
people
makers.
that get these masks and cover them up in plaster.
Well, there is some
Who's
naive-
making
there
that
is-
decision?
Those are inexperienced people.
They
Somebody-
let the mask in the hands of an unexperienced person and said, go ahead and plop a couple extra inches on that chin.
Right. Somebody else.
So you're saying it's just an oversight? Like,
No, I'm
oh,
saying
we
there's
didn't
good
realize.
people that work up there, and there's inexperienced people.
I
And
agree
a lot
with
of them
that.
aren't sensitive to objects. They don't know. They're
Why aren't they
I'm-
showing this mask? Why do they fix it up and still aren't showing it? So I'm like, okay, as we continue to explore his death, there's maybe something on that mask that a doctor will be able to spot and say, here's a telltale sign of XYZ. Incredibly important.
I would go to the president's exhibit on the second floor of the Church History Museum and look at the artifacts that they have for each of the presidents. I think they're fair. I would go up there to the Brigham Young exhibit. Justice Smith's is my favorite, but compare this artifact to the extant objects that they have available to display. And I bet there's some pretty good objects, but I bet this is as good as any. I bet if you're trying to show 25 things from Brigham Young, this is a pretty important thing.
Right. What I would like to end this conversation with is a plea to whoever is responsible for the ones who work in the church history department at that museum who feel this way about history is, can we x-ray the mask? Can we see what's under that chin? Next, can we see Hyrum's shirt? Because they put his vest and his pants, and his watch, and all the other artifacts in the Carthage display, but they won't put his shirt. Why? If we could have access to that shirt and run tests on the blood, we can see if it was more than one person's blood. If that blood comes back as John Taylor, how interesting would that be? But I'm sure you could explain that away. But if Joseph Smith's blood ends up on Hyrum's shoulder, then we know that Joseph Smith was shot in the room. And that's a huge detail because there's a lot of argument about whether he was shot in the room or he wasn't shot until he was on the ground. So I'm like, this is hugely important. Can we please analyze this stuff? Don't just tuck it away. Let us see it. The history wrapped into this is too important.
Well, you couldn't differentiate Hyrum's blood from Joseph's blood today, I don't think.
So I don't know. It depends on, because there's enough descendants of both that I wonder if you could distinguish them. But if you could run tests on the shirt and find more than one source of blood, isn't that alone worth being able to know that fact?
They would both have the same Y DNA and the same mitochondrial DNA, and you wouldn't be able to get nuclear DNA. I don't think that you could isolate.
Maybe that's true.
Differentiate between those two.
Maybe that's true, but still, why not put the shirt out? Why not let us see it? In Carthage, you could let us set up a scanner in the room that causes no damage to this room that could see under the plaster. Are there any bullet marks in this stone?
I think that would be extremely useful.
Stone is still there, the original stone, if there's no bullet marks in it, which there's a record of that being the case. But if we could prove that, that's hugely important. So that's really what I wanted to end this episode with, is a plea to the church and with the temple, with the Kirtland Temple that they just became custodians of.
So important. If you go in there and start putting in elevators and bathrooms and maybe even worse, locker rooms, and completely reconfigure the building, then you don't have an opportunity to do things like, what if a document surfaces 25 years from now and it has more information about the Kirtland endowment than we today have, which we mostly rely on the Stephen Post diaries. What if we found another document that tells us something, and then we need to go back and look and see how this particular writer is describing a space, and that space is now obliterated and replaced with an elevator.
But it's out of respect for the people who built that temple, the people who carved everything in it.
Exactly.
They took away that from Nauvoo, right? And John at least has pieces of that, but they've done whatever they've done with the temple here.
Now, we both agree if the foundation's caving in, go shore it up.
Yes,
absolutely.
Just like the hinges on a book.
Right.
Exactly.
But the Salt Lake Temple, shoring up the foundation, what did they do with all of the artifacts from the temple that they removed?
They allegedly put them through a wood chipper.
Why? They throw all of the Nauvoo stones in a field, and it's just an approach to history that I don't agree with. And I know you don't agree with as well. Last word from you.
Painting.
That's it.
Painting.
Oh, do you want to see? You're familiar with this image of Joseph Smith.
Oh, yeah.
This image is made by an artist very few Latter-day Saints have heard of. His name is Sutliff Maudsley, but everybody's familiar with the images by Maudsley of Joseph, of Lucy, of Hyrum, of their wives, of their children, of other patrons of the art in Nauvoo. And I brought the originals.
Oh, no way.
So here is an engraving. This is an 1842 engraving in John Bennett's History of the Saints. This is an original pen and ink with two colors of ink, brown and black, image of Joseph Smith drawn from life by his neighbor. Sutcliffe Maudsley was a backlotter who lived behind the Joseph Smith house in one of those dugouts.
Incredible.
And from that, then Maudsley would make,
So this was Maudsley's copy?
that's Maudsley's own copy of the Book of Mormon that he drew. He came from England in 1841, the year this was printed, and came to Nauvoo, moved in behind Joseph Smith as Joseph Smith's charity case. Joseph Smith let him live in the back of his lot in a little hut. And he was disabled because he had been in the textile industry in England. So when he got to, he was a poor case. People helped the Maudsley family. But Emma and Joseph loved Sutcliffe Maudsley, and they repeatedly got him back to do more images of Joseph and more images of Emma and all their family, their brothers, all the Smith brothers, William Law. Everybody had pictures made by Maudsley because the Smiths loved the Maudsleys. So you know the Maudsleys are accurate. The death mask helps. They help each other when people say the death mask is distorted, or they say the Maudsley image isn't accurate, but they're perfectly right.
Right.
The profiles are identical.
Can you see a cleft in that chin?
No,
He's
but
sort of, I don't know.
But I'm working on some work on Hyrum's other portraits that are made by others besides Sutcliffe Maudsley, and I will have an answer for you very
Cool.
soon.
Thank you, John, for
Thank you.
joining me today. I appreciate your feedback. You've given me a lot
Thank
that
you.
I need to work on still. Thank you, Anna,
You're
for
challenging. You know this topic very well.
like I said, not a lot of people look into this one, so maybe this will inspire more people to appreciate artifacts like this and look into it more. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.